And thank you so much to Andrew Savoya for a really nice introduction. That was really beautiful. We're happy to be joined by members of the administration, youth advocates, activists, and probably most importantly, members of Gen Z themselves. They can help us better understand their values, beliefs, and where their common ground lies in our hopes to co-create change. And I'd also, of course, like to thank our sponsor, the Walton Family Foundation, for their support of the evening's event. But first, a few housekeeping notes. I'd like to ask you all to keep your cell phones on silent. I promise you can look at them afterwards. But we do encourage you to join the conversation on social media. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at The Hill Events, and we will be using the hashtag #TheHillGenZ. And with that, I'm very excited to welcome our first panel to the stage. The oldest members of Generation Z are entering the workforce. They're able to vote. And like some, Maxwell Frost, who is from my home district in Central Florida, they're even old enough to become elected members of Congress. It's important that we understand their values, identities, and desires to give us a better sense of who they are and who they expect and what they expect for the path ahead. Joining us now for a deeper dive into the question of who is Gen Z is John Della Volpe, Director of Polling at the Harvard Kennedy School Institute of Politics and author of Fight, How Gen Z is Channeling Their Fear and Passion to Save America, and Ava McDonald, the 21-year-old Georgetown student and founder and CEO of Zfluence, a social media marketing company that partners with Gen Z consumers. Ava and John, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to pose a question to both of you. First, to start off with, talk about who Gen Z is and what their core issues are. I mean, we saw historically, a very historically important election last Tuesday or last week, and defying the historical norms and such. And a lot of that, I think, can be attributed to Gen Z. So I want our audience to understand who this generation is. Ava, I'd like to go first to you because you are, of course, a member of Gen Z.
Yes, well, first, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and I'm excited to offer a Gen Z perspective. I think when you define Gen Z, I think the most important thing to consider is that Gen Z, more than anything, is concerned with authenticity. And Gen Z wants to participate in the kinds of things that are directly affecting them, whether that's social media, whether that's politics. So being that Gen Z is the first generation to never know a world without the digital media, we are very sensitive to the kinds of things that we see, the ways that we're represented. So I think that as a demographic group, it's important to consider how Gen Z isn't okay with just being spoken to or told what they want, but they want to be listened to and heard and involved in the kinds of things that are directly impacting their lives.
Yeah, and John, you've studied this group quite a bit and how they've been involved politically and their political evolution. Talk about your findings in that field.
Sure. Again, thank you for having me and being. I'm always nervous speaking with an actual member of the generation. Make sure that you check me if I say something that doesn't sound right. But I've been studying young Americans now for 22 years, a long time. And I was really struck in 2017, essentially when the eldest members of this generation were coming of age, thinking about politics for the first time. And there's two or three things that I take away from this. I don't think that there's any generation in at least 70 years who has dealt with more trauma more quickly before their brain is actually fully developed than Generation Z, right? Born just on the, thank you. Born on just after such a kind of 9/11, the Great Recession, really being one of their first memories in the disquiet kind of in the home, going to school thinking that should be a place where it should feel safe. It's anything but safe because of school shootings and lockdown drills, thinking about middle school and high school, the tremendous impact that opioid abuse had, climate change, the concern about the whiplash between no drama Obama versus Trump, just a lot of chaos in their lives. But rather than, and we've seen that obviously sadly through the increasing levels of depression and death by suicide. However, what gives me hope is that despite all those weights that so many members of Ava's generation carry, rather than pulling back, they actually lean forward and have been voting, not just in this cycle, but in the last 2 cycles at rates that no other generation previous has voted. When baby boomers were younger, when Gen X was younger, when millennials were younger, they voted at somewhere between 25 and 50% less often than this generation. And we have a very different outcome of this last election, if not for Gen Z. If you just look at the number of voters under the age of 30, only 11%. But they added 3 percentage points in the Democratic column on a national basis.
Yeah.
They essentially kind of canceled out the 28% of voters over the age of 65 who had voted Republican by 3 points. So really relatively small generation in terms of their impact in the midterm election, but had significant influence because of the overwhelming support they gave for Democrats by 28 points.
And do you think we would have seen more of an actual red wave instead of a red trickle or misting?
There was a red wave among votes over the age of 40.
Yeah, but yeah.
Right, so folks over the age of 40 were 11 points voted for Republicans by 11 points. Mm-hmm. Voters under 40, the combination of millennials and G, plus 18 for Democrats. Plus 18 for Democrats, minus 11, a 29-point difference. So there was a red wave among Gen Xers and boomers and silent generation. It was like the force, the passion, the intensity, not just the turnout, but the 28-point margin for the youngest of this generation that is responsible for essentially kind of blocking that red wave and electing Fetterman and Kelly in particular. Each of those candidates got over 70% of the under 30 vote.
Right.
70%. It's huge.
Right, right. And Ava, just as a member of the generation and you're consuming this political content that maybe the Fetterman campaign is feeding Gen Z voters, I mean, I think a lot of us, I covered the campaign quite closely, and a lot of us were skeptical as to whether his digital presence would really break through. A lot of us thought it, was sort of had to deal with the fact that he wasn't physically on the campaign trail for quite some time. But do you think someone who has a digital-centric campaign like that is able to better communicate with members of the Gen Z population?
Absolutely, and I think that it's important for politicians to meet Gen Z where they are. Personally, I do not consume any news in a physical newspaper. All of the news that I am consuming is either online, via social media, or I guess through friends who are also seeing things online and sending them to me. So it's interesting to consider with this new demographic the way that the kind of transfer of information has changed. And in order to attract a different demographic, you really have to think about, where are they? Because we are not, picking up physical newspapers, we are not consuming information in the same way that generations past have. So I think that's definitely really important.
Right, right. And then in terms of, I guess, the issue, and I asked you this question at the beginning, but I want to delve deeper into it. Maxwell Frost, the first member of Gen Z to be elected to Congress, he focused quite a bit on gun control and combating gun violence throughout his campaign. He himself was a victim of gun violence. That's an issue, but also, the pandemic and such. I mean, I think I always look back to my alma mater, Ithaca College, and I wonder, oh my gosh, how did all of these students who were meant to graduate in person had to finish up virtually and such? The pandemic had such probably just a totally different impact on your generation. Do you think those are the two main drivers, pandemic response, but also gun control for Generation Z voters, or is there something more?
I think that those are, of course, factors, because those are two things that have really impacted us. So I graduated high school during COVID. I began college at Georgetown during COVID. So that was a very big period of time where I felt pretty isolated and really only had social media to connect with my friends.
Yeah.
And that's also another reason why I feel like it's so important that politicians consider where Gen Z is, because at that time, and even in the business that I'm in, which is Gen Z influencer marketing and authenticity, companies would ask me all the time, like, isn't this an awful time for social media marketing because we're in COVID? And I say all the time that, like, Gen Z is on their phone now more than ever. And that is not something that has changed post-COVID. So, I mean, that is something that's remained true during COVID, and it's also in the way that we discuss political issues and are also talking about the things that are important to us, whether that's gun control or violence or other things that are impacting us as a generation and will impact future generations as we get older.
And John, turning back to some of these candidates, so you had Maxwell Frost on the Democratic side. He won his election pretty handily. Caroline Leavitt was at one point, I think, projected or predicted to potentially win.
Well, that's a whole other conversation.
A whole other conversation. I wanted to get a sense as to, maybe she's a member of Generation Z. He is too, but do you think her campaign could have done something different to appeal to or is it just the fact that Generation Z voters lean to the left?
They more than lean to the left. This is like each generation has a different identity. My generation, Gen X, has essentially kind of been split 50-50 now, certainly leaning more right than center recently, but there's opportunities, I think, for Democrats and Republicans to kind of engage with this generation if they choose to. Perhaps one of the more remarkable surveys I conducted this year for my company, Social Sphere, conducted a project for Snapchat. And among 18 to 20 different issues and values related to this election, we found that preserving individual rights and freedoms was number one. In a survey we conducted in January, 5 months before the Alito leak, 6 months before the Dobbs decision. That was already kind of in the air. And the reason is because I think there's so many young people are concerned around culture war and concerned that those more vulnerable than them are under attack. In the Harvard survey we released a few weeks before the election, 73% of Americans feel that other Americans are under attack. 59% feel like they're under attack. So the combinations of those three things, two things, that's the reality that Gen Zers, I think, are carrying. And that is a significant driver of motivation to go out there and to kind of participate in civic life, specifically in voting. And, the Dobbs decision really kind of cemented that as a driver. And just like in 2018, when we saw increasing levels of participation in voting post the March for Our Lives movement, we saw the same thing happening in Kansas. And there were plenty of warning signs that this would be as significant a turnout as we saw in 2020 and 2018. So yeah, I think Caroline Leavitt, though she reflects a portion, I don't think she speaks for a plurality, or certainly not a majority of her generation, because younger people, remember, before that, like Bernie Sanders. So it's not about age, it's about the values. Values, number one. Number two is the way I say it is messenger, and number three is message.
And speaking of those values and messaging, it seems like at the end, well, maybe throughout the campaign, but it was certainly amplified at the end, this idea of protecting democracy, pushing back against these election-denying pro-MAGA candidates really seemed to work well for Democrats, obviously. Ava, as a member of the generation watching that, do you think that was a strong message that, you guys had to sit through and watch January 6th like the rest of us? You're old enough to obviously comprehend it and such. Was that a powerful message?
Yeah, I think it was definitely a moment for Gen Zers. I know that the majority of Gen Zers do identify as left-leaning, but there are some who are right-leaning. But in that moment of January 6th, I feel like us as an entire generation came together, and it was a big moment that we realized what was going on with the country. And I think after that, a lot of people who might not have participated were motivated to become more involved, to learn more, to read more about it, to maybe take a politics class or a government class in their high school or college. So I think that was definitely a big point where members of Gen Z realized that participation is really important, because this is the world that we're going to inhabit. This is the country we're going to inhabit, and it's going to have the most impact on us, not our parents or our grandparents.
And John, we've talked about these issues, protecting democracy, abortion access, and look, I'll say it, I was skeptical that over whether those would be issues that would really break through. I think for a lot of us pundits and those in the media, admittedly, we thought this was going to come down to the inflation and the economy and crime, the situation at the southern border, and maybe in some cases it did, but clearly there were these other issues. I guess where did we get that wrong? Where did some of the polling or the forecasting get that wrong? Was that because we didn't look too closely at Gen Z?
I think that's a big part of it. CBS News released a poll, the last poll before the election, which indicated that they didn't find it to be likely, but that if the Democrats were going to have a chance to hold the House, it was going to be because of what Gen Z was going to deliver. We've been doing this for 22 years. We've conducted 100,000 surveys, okay, over that time, hundreds of focus groups. Our research indicating we do a couple thousand just 18 to 29-year-olds every single wave. Our research indicated that just as many said they intended to vote as in 2018. The average political survey, if there's 1,000 people or even a couple thousand people, which is a lot, still only has a few hundred, right? And I think it's certainly kind of conventional wisdom that young people, don't show up for elections, right? But listen, if you were a betting person, you win more than you would have lost over the last 40 years. When baby boomers were young voters, when Gen X were young voters, and millennials were young voters, the highest level they've ever participated in a midterm election was 21%. So any baby boomer or Gen Xer or anybody older than 30 who complains about young people voting, the chances you probably didn't vote or voted at a lower level. When 2018 came, Gen Z doubled the level of participation from the previous election. Wow. And they voted for the first time at record numbers in 2020. And they were responsible for those 5 battleground states going from red to blue. And they did the same thing. So the data is there if you open your eyes and actually look for it, number one. The other, two other issues, I think, in terms of the way we think about polling. One is so many people are focused on one issue, right? Inflation. Well, the other 4 issues after that, oftentimes, were democracy or abortion or climate or things that certainly went in towards the Democrats' favor, right? So I think it was a mistake to say it's just single-issue voters on the economy. And the other thing is about this enthusiasm, right? Younger people might not have been as enthusiastic to vote, but as I say, I'm not enthusiastic to go to the dentist next week, but I'm still going to go, right? It's not the best measure anymore, right? Mm-hmm. So the last thing I'd just say on this is I looked at NBC polling a year ago. It was a 2-point Republican advantage. Every single month they tracked. October, their last poll was a 1-point Republican advantage. So there really wasn't as much change when you pull back as we might think when we look at some of these aggregators.
Ava, do you feel that as a Gen Z voter, oftentimes you're overlooked, or do you think campaigns are making a concerted effort to appeal to members of your generation?
I think that campaigns are making more of an effort as time goes on and as Gen Z becomes eligible to vote. I was able to vote for the first time in 2020. But I do think that campaigns are starting to realize that Gen Z has a lot of power and that we will go to the polls and that we'll vote and that this actually means something to us. And politics are something that we're talking about because, that's what we see on social media. We have the opportunity to engage digitally with the news. We have information that is so readily accessible to us. So I think it's good because I think campaigns are finally realizing that Gen Z is a powerful demographic that will show up and is talking about politics.
And with your work with Zfluence, you are trying to promote marketing for members of the generation and such. What would you tell companies, what would you tell campaigns that are trying to appeal to your demographic?
I think the biggest thing to tell companies or campaigns that are trying to appeal to Gen Z is to listen. So I'm running my company. I'm a member of Gen Z. Our entire network of more than 5,000 Gen Zers, reaching 55 million Gen Zers nationwide, are all Gen Z. And we all have opinions, and we all have thoughts. And the thing that's so cool is that Zfluence started as an influencer marketing platform But now brands are working with their Zfluencers as advisory board members. And they're asking them, like, is this good? Do you like how this aligns with this value? Is this something that's important to you? So I think it's cool also that brands and campaigns have aligned themselves with social values that are important to show that they're actually doing the work, and that they want to appeal to Gen Z in a way that's not just capitalizing on something they read online that Gen Z cares about, but they're really listening to them. And that kind of goes back to the point that Gen Z wants to participate, and when they feel listened to, they will.
Yeah. And John, I mean, I'm a millennial. You said you're a member of Gen X. What do you think we get wrong about Generation Z voters?
I think it's what Ava said, like the lack of listening, to truly listen and to kind of shape, again, not just focus on what, as a pollster, not what the message is, but where do our values align with Gen Z's values, right? And I think that's really what we don't spend enough time doing, truly listening through qualitative and other kinds of informal research.
Right. Well, speaking of listening, I think we have time for a few audience questions. So we have folks with microphones. If anyone has a question, just a few minutes.
I have a question for Ava. So one thing that I learned recently, I'm a millennial, so one thing I learned recently, and I work with a lot of Gen Z activists, and I learned that for Gen Z, the experience of the insurrection was particularly visceral because of a connection between what students face in schools with the gun violence epidemic. And the message that apparently was going around in social media was like, now they know how we feel. Is that something that you picked up on, or is that something you can comment upon?
That is really interesting, and I had never thought about that connection explicitly before, but I mean, it makes sense. And also I think just we've experienced so many school shootings. It's like there's one happening all the time, and we're seeing it on social media, and it's become something that's unfortunately so expected and a part of just the world that we're in right now. So that makes complete and total sense, but it is a shame, and it calls out the point that it's become something that's so expected that there's violence at a place that there really shouldn't be. But that is a really interesting theory.
As we look for the next question, just one point. A year ago, 7% in our Harvard youth survey indicated that we had a healthy democracy. Today, it's 4%. 4% of 18 to 29-year-olds are inheriting what they would consider to be a healthy democracy. Yet, we wonder why, was democracy on the ballot? And I give them so much credit for participating in what they feel is such an unhealthy democracy. That's the difference between this generation and others. They don't like it, they think it needs reform, but they're willing to do the work to reform it.
That's very important. So we have less than a minute left, so I'll just wrap up this panel. Ava and John, thank you so much. It's great to get all of your insight on such a very important topic and learn something new today. Thank you.